Welcome to the All Creatures Podcast. This is Chris, and today I am joined with Dr. Shermin de Silva. She is the founder of Trunks and Leaves. We are going to have another amazing discussion about elephants, my favorites. Welcome, Shermin.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me on your show. I'm so glad to be here.
I mean, I could literally probably do Angie knows this. I could probably literally do a elephant podcast on my own and just talk about them every week. I love them so much.
So I did listen to your earlier one on elephants in preparation. So,
and it's
interest of full disclosure.
Yeah, you can only scratch the surface in an hour. Like, there's just so much to them, to all these creatures and animals. But thank you. So, I guess my first question is, because we have so many listeners that are either working in conservation or they really want to get involved in conservation. So I always like to ask, your background and how you got to where you are today. So, please take as long as you want, but how did you really, I guess from childhood on, get into conservation and get to where you are today?
Yeah. So, I was the kind of kid who loved to watch nature documentaries, right? And what kid doesn't, but when I grew up in Sri Lanka, and this was not something that we had 24/7. Like, we had TV only in the evenings. We had 2 channels. It makes me sound like I was born in the 1950s or something, but like that was what we had in Sri Lanka, and we had a very limited number of programs. We had like some British programming. We had Marty Stauffer's Wild America, which I adored. I think it's like from the 1970s. This is like the 80s for us. But, and I just, dreamed about, working with animals like ever since I was a kid. But I grew up in a city. I grew up in Colombo, which is, a pretty busy metropolis. And my family was not very outdoorsy. So I didn't really even realize that there was nature in the country. Like, it all seemed like it was all, it was just on TV. And then fast forward, many years, my family moved to the U.S. I studied here, and I really wanted to study animal behavior. And when I was in college, I took the classes, and I got really interested in how animals think and communicate, and I wanted to study how animals communicate and how that relates to human language, how we communicate. And I pretty much I decided, okay, if I'm going to grad school, what am I going to study? I have to pick a species. And I made a list. I literally made a list of all of the, the papers that I had read and things that I had seen of species that looked like they might be interesting to study. So on that list were, primates, dolphins, ravens and corvids, and elephants were on that list. And now I knew in Sri Lanka we had lots of monkeys and we had lots of elephants, because when I was growing up, this is kind of part of the background. That's just part of the culture, and it just they were just there. I took them for granted. But then when I looked into the research, I was surprised at this time. This was back in the mid 2000s or early 2000s. There had hardly been any research on Asian elephants in the wild. So I knew all about African elephants. I had read about African elephant research. I had, seen the documentaries, and I knew that African elephants produce these low frequency vocalizations. And I was really interested in studying more, about elephant vocalizations, because it seemed like there was a lot of research to be done. And I thought, well, gee, if we've had Asian elephants around in captivity for so long, thousands of years, we must know way more about Asian elephants. So, but then when I looked it up, I was shocked that there was, this one book from the Smithsonian back in the 1970s. And pretty much since then, there had been, some books on sort of like the general ecology, and a lot of research on captive elephants, and you're probably familiar with, right? Things like reproduction and feeding and all of this physiology. But there were hardly any published studies. Like, there were maybe 2 papers out at that time on behavior, like in the wild, in elephants. And I thought, that can't be right. But I looked, and yeah, that was it. And so I thought, well, there's lots of people working on these other species. And here's something that is like, seems like it's right under your nose, it's right in people's backyards, literally in some cases, and we'll talk more about that. And we just have to know more. And so that's how I got into elephants, because I also wanted to work on something that would allow me to go back to Sri Lanka because I wanted to maintain that connection. And I had family there, and there was so much of the country that I had not really explored when I was growing up there. And so this was also a way for me to sort of rediscover that. And so that's how I got into Asian elephants, in particular. And then once I got started, I just found that there's more than I veered from studying communication to just the whole social system and how that works, because before you can understand communication, you have to understand the social structure, and we were in for some surprises there. So that it all went off from there.
I mean, yeah, I'm gobsmacked. I'm surprised that the behavioral research in elephants is lacking. And did you find that in, say, African versus Asian? Was there more literature or research published studies in African
Yeah, that
elephants?
was definitely the case, because now, like for example, even with vocal communication, like so this, the discovery like that elephants communicate using infrasound, that was actually done in the zoo at the time, the Oregon Zoo, which is what's now the Oregon Zoo, and on Asian elephants. But the since that time, and even before that, the research in the wild, it has been really focused on African elephants, pretty much since the 1970s onwards. And there's been a lot of really excellent research done both in East Africa and South Africa, and so a lot of the even the scientific literature, when people talked about elephants, and just elephants with a capital E, most and they sort of tended to lump everything together. But African elephants are not representative of all elephants. African elephants, in fact, are two different species. Now, most people, agree. There's the forest elephant and the savanna elephants, and they themselves are quite different behaviorally. And that's an entirely separate genus from Asian elephants. And I tell people, according to the current estimate, the divergence time between the Asian and African branches of the family tree is about 5 to 7 million years, and it's approximately the span of time separating, say, tigers, leopards, and lions from their common ancestor, right?
Yeah.
And so you wouldn't really lump together leopards and lions and tigers. They're very different animals. And so why would we confuse the elephants? They just kind of superficially, they do look similar, and elephants are elephants to the extent, they have a long trunk, and they have big ears, and they, eat the same kinds of food, generally. But there are differences. It might be a little bit more subtle than, say, tigers and lions. But there's a lot to learn. So, yeah, I think even among scientists, that tendency has kind of, the inertia of it has continued. Like today, when people just sort of talk about elephants, they're really talking about savanna elephants, I feel like, because that's where a lot of the research and also the publicity has been.
Yeah. I mean, they're so iconic, and it's just, when you think elephant, that's probably what a lot of people think, but. You're right. Like when I was getting started getting involved in my research. I mean, I did dabble a little bit in African elephants, but yeah, it was mainly Asians, because we had access to them. And I want the listeners to really think about that, because one of the things we cover when we talk about a species is their natural history. And you're right. I never thought of it that way, that Asian elephants diverged so long ago, like these other species of big cats. So that's a fascinating point, because you even think behavior between a forest elephant and a savanna elephant is going to be night and day. So you can only imagine, and we're going to jump into it, the difference between Asians and Africans. Yeah, that's fascinating. So I guess to kind of start laying this out, where are we in the beginning of 2021 with Asian elephant conservation? The big picture. So what are some of the conflicts we're looking at right now?
Hmm.
And, what's their populations looking like right now?
Yeah. So in 2020, as of the last sort of roundup of estimates from around the different countries, so there are 13 countries that wild Asian elephants still survive in, and it looks like their population has been keeping relatively stable between 40 and 50,000. So if you split the difference, somewhere around 44, 45,000. Um, and the large bulk of that, like 60% or so, is in India, because India is the biggest country out of those 13 countries. And so it has the largest land area for elephants. The next biggest population is, in fact, in Sri Lanka, which is not the second largest range state, and then on down through the list. So those populations represent the South Asian or mainland subspecies of Asian elephant. Some people call them the Indian elephant, but that's actually kind of a misnomer. It should just be the mainland elephant. And then the recognized subspecies right now actually include, like, so Sri Lanka's is kind of separately recognized, but there's some debate whether genetically they're distinct from the mainland. So I lump them together with the mainland. And then there's the Bornean elephants, which are not recognized as a distinct subspecies, but I think they pretty soon will be, because there's pretty broad consensus that they should be. And they're numbering just a few, maybe a few thousand, or it's not quite clear how many there are. And then the Sumatran elephants also similarly numbering a few thousand. And the Sumatran elephants are recognized as a distinct subspecies. In fact, they're the one subspecies that is classified as critically endangered. Um, and so the three populations are doing, their status is different. The mainland elephants, because we have so many of them, they're responsible for the bulk of that 45,000. But even the mainland elephants, if you go country by country, in Southeast Asia, they're doing far worse. So the population that is most threatened right now is in Vietnam, where they're in double digits, and they're very fragmented. So there's just, little pockets of elephants, because the habitats are so fragmented. And then, other parts of Southeast Asia, the population sizes are, about comparable to, just in the few hundreds here and there. And, if you add them all up, you might have a few thousand elephants, but they're not really dispersing, they're not really mingling. So you have a problem with, like, gene flow, spawn populations. And so those are big threats to so many elephant populations. And then by and large, the biggest issue for Asian elephants throughout the range countries is what people call human-elephant conflict. Now, what that really is elephants kind of trying to make a living, people trying to make a living, and there being negative interactions between people and elephants as a result. Largely, it's because people need land and elephants need land, and there's only a limited amount of that, and people generally, tend to expand and encroach. The progression of human activities just keeps eating away at elephant habitat. And so, elephants are big animals. They live a long time. And when they lose habitat, they don't just sort of, lay down and die. They continue, they carry on. And so in some cases, it means that populations that were otherwise, hidden from view are now visible. In other cases, these populations are being displaced from one place to another. And so they might be moving. They might be moving into areas where people have no experience with elephants, so they don't know what to do, and that might create conflict. Quite often it means passing through agricultural landscapes or plantations or places, that where elephants are not welcome. And so all of this is what falls under the umbrella term, quote unquote, conflict. And then there are more rarer, instances where elephants actually do damage property or, injure or even kill people this happens in places where there's, the really high conflict areas are where there's really very little habitat. In fact, very little elephants. There's maybe just a few elephants that are responsible for the bulk of those conflicts. So then the next sort of the consequence of that is that, elephants then are also injured or killed by people. So people might initially take sort of more passive approaches, just chasing elephants away or trying to put up barriers or fences or things. And then, but when people get sufficiently desperate, they take more drastic means, taking either weapons or poison or other means that can be lethal to elephants as a means of trying to control or divert elephants and deter elephants.
Yeah. It's very complex, and I know we'll kind of get into this a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It just came up in my head. What do you know the population or the total population of captive Asian elephants? And I know it's going to differ, by country, but talking about exploitation and also as working animals. Do we have a handle on how many we have in that?
That's a good question. I don't know what the global population is. I know that there are several thousand captive elephants in Myanmar and Thailand, respectively, and those are the two largest captive elephant populations that I'm aware of. The captive elephant populations, even in countries where they have been, they've historically played a large role, like India and Sri Lanka, I think are much smaller. In Sri Lanka, it's just over 100. It's fewer than 200. In India, it's probably, again, in the hundreds, not thousands. And in the other countries I'm not really familiar with. That's different from, the ones that are outside of range countries, like in zoos and things. So I think that's a pretty small number.
Very tiny, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the captive elephant populations are that are sort of most concern are these big ones in Thailand and Myanmar, as far as what's their fates. And I think we'll probably get into that a little bit more as well.
Yeah.
Later on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I guess talking about Asian elephants, what are some of the misconceptions about them?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because I talked to a lot of people, and I find a few misconceptions that come up very frequently all the time. And one we already talked about, which is, this kind of conception that Asian elephants and African elephants are somehow are the same, and people just sort of lumping them together, and they're not. And the other one is, and I think this feeds into that, it is because people are so used to seeing Asian elephants in captivity in zoos, and then until recently in things like circuses and entertainment. There's an assumption that Asian elephants are somehow more tame, or even you hear the word domesticated. People use the word domesticated, and in fact, in Thailand, elephants that are in captivity are essentially treated like draft animals, like donkeys or cattle or something. And so this word gets thrown around, but in fact, technically, scientifically, as domestication means that an animal has to have been bred for generations with certain features that have been selected for people to serve some kind of purpose. So when you say a horse is domesticated, the horse that you see today is very different from the ancestral horse 5,000 years ago, or 6,000, or whenever that happened. And likewise, so are dogs. Dogs are quite different from wolves. And they have a bunch of, not only physical traits, but also personality, character traits and behavioral traits that we have selected. And that's even true for plants. We've selected features that we want. So, but in the case of elephants, that's never been done. So elephants are fairly unique in terms of all of the different species that humans interact with and, have been in company with, because we have a 5,000-year history of interaction with them. But it's pretty remarkable when you consider that they've never actually been domesticated. The elephants that are in captivity, until the very recent past, have had some connection to the wild. And even the ones that are in captivity, these large populations that I mentioned, they're allowed to go out and breed with wild elephants. And so they're still very much wild animals, even the ones that are in captivity. so that's a big misconception, and I think that unfortunately also undermines conservation to some extent, because people view elephants kind of as sort of like they're taken for granted, like I said before, like, oh, they're practically domestic, right? They're like draft animals, but they're not. And they're, in fact, the other misconception is that they're less endangered somehow than African elephants.
Yeah.
But numerically, Asian elephants are outnumbered by African elephants 10 to 1. And so, if anything, they're more endangered. Which is not to say African elephants don't have problems. They do. I mean, they have severe problems. But the main thing that people think of when they think of, like, oh, what are the conservation challenges for elephants? The first thing they think of is ivory, the ivory trade, which has gotten a lot of attention because it has been really detrimental to African elephant populations, and it has severely depleted African elephant populations. But because Asian elephants don't all have tusks, in fact, only the males have tusks, and a fraction of males actually don't have tusks. If you take different populations, it's a different percentage of males that have tusks. But for example, in Sri Lanka, there's very small numbers, like 2 to 3%. It's probably like the most skewed population, where most males don't have tusks. So as long as you have animals in the population, and females don't have tusks ever, if that's not really a threat as to the extent that it is for African elephants, where both sexes can have tusks. And so that's another big misconception. The ivory trade has been in the past, really has been responsible, for example, for skewing sex ratios in parts of India, and there was a time when it looks like pretty much all the bulls, or the older bulls, had been wiped out because of the ivory poaching.
Mm.
And so it's not. I don't want to downplay the impact that's had historically, but just right now, it's not the main issue. The main issue is the habitat loss and the conflict that results from that. So those are, I think, the major misconceptions, and the fact that just because there are elephant populations in captivity, I think there are lots of difficult conversations to be had about what those captive elephants are doing in terms of their role they play in conservation. So it's common to think of captive animal populations as being a sort of insurance policy, right? As a safety measure in case of extinction. And there are many species for which we have examples where they've been successfully brought back or rescued through those captive breeding efforts and released into the wild. So that can be really important. But for elephants, as you again know, they breed really slowly, right?
Yeah.
They reproduce, on a good day, right? Like under good circumstances, they have a really long gestation period, which is 2 years, and then there's a period where the calf is nursing, which is another couple of years. So minimally, the mom can have another calf, every 3 years, but more optimally for her and for the calf, every 4 years. We've found that in the population we've been studying, that the median age, the median birth interval is about 6 years. So the median, that's the middle. That means that there's animals that have even longer birth intervals, right? And so the short end is 3, the middle is 6, and then the long tail of that, we don't even know how long it can be. It might be 10 years, who knows? And so those are attributes that are not really conducive to breeding an animal in captivity, right? If you're going to breed them, you really want them to be prolific, and elephants are not that. And so, as of now, there's no scenario in which the captive elephant populations are going to be able to rescue wild elephant populations. Now, It may be possible, with some of these really large captive populations, that people are experimenting with rewilding them and trying to, release them back into the wild. And these are animals that have had human contact, that have been working, for example, in the timber industry and whatnot. So, there is some prospect that these animals could play a role, and I think that's really exciting. But as far as like breeding elephants, for the purpose of bringing back extinct population, we're not there yet.
No. And That's what's frustrating about conservation. Some people are like, "Oh, well, cloning," and this is
Oh yeah. Oh,
anybody
we could talk about that actually. Yeah.
anybody that so anybody that listens and I was a big, when I was in academia, a big proponent because I did a lot of I was working with a lot of the early cloning work in the early 2000s. Down at Texas A&M, some of the big firsts, and I thought, wow, we're going to be able to clone the mammoth one day, and I can't wait, and I want to be involved with it. Some of my research I thought could help with it. It's the worst idea I've ever heard of because it's going to millions, if not $1 billion, to produce a mammoth for entertainment. There's
Right.
no way you're going to clone this animal and re-release them in the wild and they're going to survive and thrive. So it's interesting, even with captive animals.
Right.
So, from a behavioral expert, could you just quickly talk about, because some of the research you've been in, very pivotal studies, but, I just want to jump on this opportunity while we're talking about it. Taking a captive, not domestic, and I did want to say, to domesticate a species, the only research we have is that the silver fox study, I believe, out of Russia.
Right.
And 50 generations it took to get a domestic fox. And so for an elephant, the generation interval is 20 years? I can't remember off the top of my head. You're talking centuries to do that. But from the behavior standpoint, what some of the behaviors would be missed from an elephant that's in captivity versus one that grew up in the wild? What would be some of the things that a captive elephant would have difficulty with?
Yeah, so that's and I've been thinking about that since pretty much the beginning because initially when I was interested in studying communication, I thought it'd be really fascinating to compare the communication of wild elephants with captive elephants. And I had some colleagues where we compared just the overall vocal repertoire. And a thing that I noticed was that when I went to some of the captive elephants that were in Sri Lanka and I made recordings of them, it was really weird. And these are animals, I don't know at what age they came into captivity. But for example, in one population, in like one, there were like five animals or so. And the people that took care of them said, "Oh yeah, this one always chirps," and it was true. Like you listen and like the chirp was her go-to, vocalization. Like no matter what happened, she chirped. And then there was this other one who rumbled and liked to rumble and kind of talk to you, with rumbles, and already like this is really weird because elephants should all be able to produce the full suite of vocalizations that they have. I've described 14 or so, which are acoustically, clearly distinct to us as humans, but then there's probably some more subtle variations that elephants pick up on. And then then I wondered, well, whether they were kind of sort of, I don't know, they had these weird repertoires because they came into captivity at a really young age and never learned. But at that point, we didn't know if elephants were vocal learners. And so for your listeners, just to let them know, so vocal learning is actually quite rare in the animal kingdom. And among mammals, it's even more rare. So songbirds learn, some aquatic mammals like dolphins, whales, people know, learn. But among primates, we're pretty much it. And there's some vocal learning that has been taught to animals like chimpanzees and whatnot, but it's been really hard, and and the bottom line is they don't do it naturally. And so a few years ago, we heard of this elephant in Korea, in a South Korean zoo, that had just spontaneously started imitating its keeper with
awesome.
with words. Like it was producing words in Korean, and it was just at first. I don't know if you saw this, but there were videos that came across, and I thought, okay, that's got to be a hoax. It's got to, it's crazy. Like, it doesn't even sound like an elephant. It sounds like a midget, first of all. It sounds like, that's not a PC word, I'm sorry. But it sounded so strange to this sort of high pitched voice coming out of an elephant. And you see the video; it put its trunk inside its mouth and was like doing something funky with its trunk to get the sound out. And I thought that has to be like, a doctored video or like some audio that was like, stitched in. And so I kind of ignored it. And then another colleague of mine came to me with this video and like this observation saying, hey, they want us to do a study. And I said, oh, well, okay. And so what they did was they compared these sounds. I guess the elephant was actually producing them. They compared these sounds to Korean words, and they had blind listeners, meaning people who didn't know whether it was being produced, by a person or something else, transcribe the words and say what they heard. And so people, for the most part, accurately could distinguish what these so-called quote unquote words were. And then she also compared it to the natural vocalizations, which I provided from our recordings. And you could see, they're acoustically really distinct. I mean, not only can you hear it, but you can measure different things, and they just completely are on a different part of the spectrum. And so this was a bull. This was a male elephant, and we don't typically think of males as being very social. And it was reared pretty much, in solitary. It was kind of all by itself, and it just taught itself. He just taught himself to imitate his keeper. Some commands, 6 different commands or so, and I've been curious ever since, but unfortunately no one has even still to this day done the study, because it's really hard, whether elephants are vocal learners naturally, whether they have to acquire even their natural vocal repertoire through learning, just as, we do, or as some birds do. But I would bet my bottom dollar that they do need to do that. And so that was a long way of saying that, captive animals, that's one example of communication systems can be very complex, and that's just acoustic communication. Of course, elephants communicate through chemical signals, through visual signals, right, body language, various things. And I've been wondering whether there are differences, for example, between populations. We mentioned there are 3 different subspecies, and there are populations that are scattered, in 13 countries across different ranges that have no connection with each other, whether there might be differences in the ways that they communicate. And if you had a captive animal that had not had that exposure and were, put out into the wild and had to interact with other wild elephants, or even, rear its own offspring someday, whether they would be appropriately able to do that, because communication is really the glue that helps a society function. And elephant society, where you have a very social animal, that has to be really important. So that's one very important aspect of behavior that might be difficult to adjust in a captive. Yeah.
It's so complex. It's just so complex. And that's it. I think the greater public that don't delve into this, they think it's easy. Oh, just throw them out on the land and they'll be fine. And you're like, no, that's not even, going back to one of my earliest interviews was about rhino relocation, and they had to spend months in bomas to, and these were black rhinos from, I think, London Zoo that were transported down to Africa. And it took months and months and months to train them just what plants to eat. So,
right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very, 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 very difficult. So I guess my next question was, to switch gears a little bit, behavioral differences between Asian and African elephants. What are some of the things that your research has found?
Yeah, so the very first thing that I had to do when I started my study was identify the social groups, and I kind of thought, based on the African elephant characterization, where you have very strong family groups led by matriarchs, that's what I would find in Asian elephants, because this is kind of how people talked about elephants in general. And so when I went out there to identify my elephants, I started giving them names alphabetically, and in terms of the social groups that I thought they belonged to. And in my first couple of days in the field, I got really confused because I would see a group one day and then I would give them all, like, say, names starting with the letter A, and another group with the name starting with the letter B, and so on. And then I'd come back the next day and I'd see that some of the groups had split up, or some of the groups had merged together, or some of the individuals had transferred between groups. And I also couldn't clearly identify, like, a leader within any group. There was no clear, quote unquote, matriarch, even though there are individuals of different ages, and there's always an oldest individual in the group. But the thing that I found over the initial several years of cataloging all these individuals and keeping track of who they were seeing with is that the social system is quite a bit more fluid than what people have described for African savanna elephants. And that means that on any given day, a social group might be split up and foraging, in little splinter groups. And you can't see the entirety of the social group because they're spread out throughout the landscape. And there may be other social groups that are also similarly spread out. And what's really confusing is that they're all kind of on top of each other in space, if you think about it. So they're kind of mingling, but they're not spatially in the same place at the same time. And so this has a whole lot of consequences. So compared to African elephants, the elephants in my population don't exhibit a lot of dominance behavior or aggression. There's hardly any interactions between groups. In fact, they don't make huge groups. Now, there are other Asian elephant populations, even within Sri Lanka, that do get together in really big groups. So that behavior is flexible. And likewise, in India, there's a lot more dominance interactions in certain populations. And so it's a matter of it's a quantitative difference, not a qualitative difference necessarily. So, but what is clear is that they don't tend to have very rigid dominance hierarchies. And so, what are dominance hierarchies? Dominance hierarchies are thought of as a means to avoid conflict, to avoid competition over resources. So you have this hierarchy where everyone knows their place, and it helps to keep aggression, or rather, there might be aggression, but it helps to keep conflicts at a minimum. When you don't have that, I think what Asian elephants do in many cases is they use space to avoid each other. So that they use their sense of smell. They can tell where other elephants have been. Others probably recognize different social groups, and so they just stay out of each other's way. And this has implications, important implications, if you have elephants in a confined space, and that might be in captivity, or that might be in a protected area where their movements are constrained or they don't have enough habitat. That might mean that there's more conflict, there's more stress as a result, more aggression, and that can result because they don't have a way to get away from each other, basically. And they don't have this evolved mechanism of establishing a dominance hierarchy to resolve those conflicts.
Yeah. So how does, I guess, when you study this, how does that affect your conservation planning? Like it's got to have impacts on, again, very complex, but
Mm-hmm.
just looking at it from a big picture view.
Yeah.
How would that impact that?
Yeah, I think the main one of the main implications is when people try to manage elephants in Asia, a lot of in some cases, they move animals around for management purposes. So they might feel that elephants are causing a disturbance here, or they're pocketed over here, and so let's translocate them or move them into another area. And when they do that, especially for females and for groups, unfortunately, they might be inadvertently fragmenting those social groups, because unlike with African elephants, where the entire family might be there, and so if you do move them, you might be able to round them all up and move the whole lot of them. In the Asian elephant case, the families might be spread out, and so what you think is one herd of elephants is actually just a splinter of the entire social group. And then the other place, which I mentioned before, is that it has an impact is right now increasingly with loss of habitat. There is a tendency still for the mindset to drive elephants back into the forest. And the forest, quote unquote, the forest, which is an ever diminishing, dwindling place, and because they don't have these dominance hierarchies, and they really need the space to move, to forage, to meet their nutritional requirements, but also socially to maintain the peace. That might again be causing stress inadvertently.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just well, that's why you do what you do, right? It's just to find these solutions, and then good science. So I guess that kind of leads to the next question or topic I really want to talk about. Some of the projects that Trunks and Leaves is involved in. I know there's this project you talk about, the coexistence project. So can you kind of talk about that, and maybe some other things that you're investigating currently?
Yeah, so we started the coexistence project a few years ago. I should say that up until that point, we've primarily been research focused. So I had been, because of my training primarily being in behavior, I was focused on the population dynamics and the behavior of the elephants inside the protected area. But with the coexistence project, we really first wanted to understand the behavior of elephants outside of the protected area, because that's where the conflicts happen, and also people, right? So moving beyond elephants to understanding what people have to experience and live with. So the first very important part of the coexistence project is also research oriented, understanding human perspectives and their attitudes towards elephants, how whether they feel that they can live with elephants or not, and if not, why not. Their cultivation practices, the economics, and the whole sort of big picture. And then once we understand that, to find solutions that work for both the people and the elephants. Now, for the elephants, the requirement is relatively simple. They need food, they need land, they need water, they need to be able to move around. So how can we facilitate that? What does it take for people to accept that? And is that even safe? So one aspect of that is we've been using camera traps to study how elephants and people are using the landscape outside of the protected area, outside of this corridor, where there's agriculture, and there's people, and there's traffic, and there's vehicles, and there's people on foot, and there's a lot of activity. And what we see is that, in fact, elephants and people are using the same spaces quite effectively. Elephants are avoiding people quite effectively. And so for the most part, at least in this location, there's not so much a danger for that people will physically encounter an elephant accidentally. And so the biggest concern that people have, and rightfully so, is the economic loss that they can face if an elephant eats their crops. And so what we want to do is try, alternative crops that might be more robust to the presence of elephants. We've just been we're just in the baseline phase of understanding what people are already growing and the economics of what they're growing, and then trying to figure out what are the economics of something else that they might grow. Who might they sell it to? What could it be used in? Because obviously, before the farmers can grow something else, we need to know that there's a market for it. And so that's what we're in the process of exploring in our situation. And there are other projects that are also doing similar things.
Right. So what, I had this listed a little bit further down, but listening to you talk, what are some of the major obstacles that you're running into? And I know you're focused in Sri Lanka. These elephants are spread across 13 different countries. So is it, I wouldn't say frustrating, because in our line of work, I think in anything in conservation, it just comes with the territory, right? You just expect it. But, I guess, what are some of the obstacles? And then are you seeing that across international boundaries?
Yeah. In terms of the obstacles, so I should mention, so Trunks and Leaves, we're based in the U.S. and I'm based in the U.S. But I have this project in Sri Lanka that I've been running since before Trunks and Leaves was established. That I started for my graduate research, and that's the research project that I've been talking about. But then want to work with organizations in different countries, and we're just in the process of building those partnerships now to work in other countries as well. And I think we have some of the same common obstacles and challenges in different countries, unfortunately. Um, like one big one is just the priorities of governments. In conservation circles, the word development might have kind of become a bad word over time, because unfortunately, the development paradigms, the old-fashioned development paradigms, are still kind of the models that many countries are following, which is, build roads, build infrastructure, then economic development will come, right? And with economic development, there's a right way and there's a wrong way to go about it, and unfortunately, a lot of this development comes at the cost of nature, at the cost of wilderness, at the cost of these habitats. And so I think, just sort in terms of the big picture, that I would say is just underlying all the other challenges that come up, and these are things like land grabbing, encroachment. There's a lot of places where there's a lack of proper land rights, like land tenure, for indigenous people, for people, for native people, and just even for the rural poor, for farmers. And so when they don't have proper land rights, they don't have a proper way to manage that resource. And that's open to exploitation, where you can have a lot of, for instance, moneyed interests coming in and grabbing land and plunking down a plantation or a factory or what have you, and clearing away hundreds of acres of habitat, much more than a smallholder farmer would do. And they kind of get scapegoated for it as well, because people think of this land clearing that happens at the frontiers. It does happen that there are people who are sort of trying to eke out a living on these landscapes, clearing land. But then there's orders of magnitude more that are being just conceded away by governments, to plantations and other sort of interests. Other challenges, unfortunately, are that when it comes to managing the elephants, there's a sort of weird mindset among different agencies sometimes, where the forests are managed by one agency and the animals are managed by another agency, and they don't
Right,
really
right,
talk to
right,
each other. And this
right.
is really bizarre, but it seems to happen again and again in different countries. And so the agency responsible for managing, the conflict species, the elephants, or in this case, or what have you, have to sort of clean up the the mess left behind by other agencies that have different mandate and different priorities, whether it's timber extraction or like forest management, or in other cases promoting agriculture. So agricultural ministries can promote cultivation of crops that are palatable and are conflict prone and attract elephants, and then managing that problem is someone else's responsibility. So unfortunately, that bureaucracy, and those mindsets, can be a big source of problems. And then just the basic, I think, weight that people place on science, like just being evidence based, and that's why Trunks and Leaves, our tagline is about evidence based conservation, and why we emphasize research, because there's unfortunately a lot of management that happens that isn't evidence based, and that is not backed by research, and is just driven by political desire, or what sort of people think should be done. So
Yeah, yeah. No, it's thinking about your right belief in science. I know that it's. Oh, geez, I looked this study up years ago when I was talking about science communication, and about in the U.S. population, I think about like 40-something% really were skeptical about science and scientists, and felt like scientists were politically motivated because of the news, and that's not our training. Our training is to be evidence-based. That's what Angie and I preach. We have our opinions, but we try not to let those bleed in, because we are evidence-based communicators and scientists. So hopefully with COVID, as horrific as it is around the world, people are having more trust in the science, because now we have vaccines on being rolled out that are hopefully going to end all this, and we come out stronger. But it's interesting from a conservation viewpoint that strategies and things like that are based on science, sound science.
Mm-hmm.
And anyways, you mentioned trunks and leaves. That's great. That's a perfect transition into that, because you are the founder. So what's the foundation's mission? And I want to ask, because we have so many young listeners that are just so motivated to help. And, I've interviewed some other founders of conservation organizations. You are my hero. They are my heroes, because you're not getting wealthy. You're not doing this for money. You're not money motivated. Everybody that works in this field knows definitely you're not chasing dollar bills. What's the foundation's mission, and how did you go about setting this up?
Yeah, the mission of Trunks and Leaves is to facilitate evidence-based conservation, as I mentioned, of elephants and their habitats, because that's key, and to do that through the science, but also education and advocacy. And I set it up actually about 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago now, right after I finished my PhD, because as an academic, as you know, you can hop from place to place. And so I knew that, like, once I finished my PhD, if I wanted to do a postdoc, and maybe more than one postdoc, which is the typical in biology, I'd be moving around. And so I wanted a sort of institutional home for the research that I was doing and plan to continue doing. And so that was how I ended up creating Trunks and Leaves. And in fact, before I embarked on that, I looked for other sponsors, fiscal sponsors, that would sort of provide the incubator, or like the home for the work. I didn't plan to start an organization on my own. It's not something that I like relished doing or like took on lightly. But after I looked around, like we mentioned before, the sort of Asian elephants are sort of the underdog. Like, they don't really have the public awareness and the level of interest that some other species do. I mean, it sounds surprising given how much people love elephants and think they're cute and everything, but there's just not an awareness that they are this terribly, terribly endangered species that could disappear in our lifetimes. And so I kind of felt compelled to start an organization focused on that, and to keep furthering the research that I was doing, and also expand into other areas that, through partnerships and things.
Yeah. So what are some of the partners that you're working with, other organizations?
So, as I mentioned before, we have been very research focused until now. So I've worked with a lot in collaboration with a lot of different universities. So a lot of collaborators and students from various universities in the US and UK and Europe. And now we're through with the Coexistence Project. What I am trying to build up is a sort of grand experiment, a replicated experiment across different countries. And we've created a working group with partners from both academic and non-academic, from NGOs backgrounds, that are interested in this model that I mentioned, of trying alternative crops, of trying other economic solutions for the smallholder farmers that are facing conflict. And so my goal ideally is to have projects that represent areas with the 3 different subspecies. So something for mainland and Sumatran elephants and Bornean elephants. Right now, we have collaborations starting up for the mainland populations. The challenge, of course, as you know, is funding it. So we're right now looking on the lookout for ways to fund a larger scale experiment that would involve these different countries.
That's awesome. That's great. And I can't even believe it. Like we're almost at an hour.
Yeah.
I got about 10 minutes left. So just a couple more questions. You know, from your viewpoint, what's the greatest threat to biodiversity across the planet right now?
I think probably hands down, it's climate change right now, just because it is so all encompassing. You know, it affects us, it affects life on land, and it affects life in the water, and just everything. And but if you look at a terrestrial conservation, the other major issue is our land use, right? Our footprint on land. It not only does it make climate change worse, but it also has a very direct impact on all these different species through the habitats. Um, so I would say that is the number one and two, if you want to prioritize challenges that we have to deal with.
Yeah, no, I agree. I absolutely agree. So I'm going to slip this one in there. How can our listeners help Asian elephants? What could they do? Somebody from the United States or Australia, they don't live in habitat of Asian elephants, but what could they do to help them from afar?
Yep. So I have to say, of course, the most direct thing that you can do is, of course, support our work and organizations like ours directly, because that support is really crucial to letting us continue to do the work that we're doing. Um, and beyond that, every person listening, I think, has recognized that, even if a problem seems far away, you don't maybe live with elephants, and so it's kind of hard. It's not an easy pat answer, like, boycott this product or that, but be a responsible consumer, and be a responsible traveler. For example, there are lots of elephants in these captive situations, and we have on our website some guidelines on how to be responsible when you travel, because those captive populations do interact with wild populations and can have an impact on wild populations. And and then the products that you buy, they're sourced from these faraway countries, and they're sourced from raw materials from landscapes where elephants live in. So just in your day to day, to be responsible. And again, we have tips on that on our website, and people can follow us on social um, for more tips. And then, given the moment, we were just talking about this earlier. As we speak right now, there's some crazy protests going on in Washington D.C. And I just have to remind all our listeners, or like around the world, like, it doesn't matter where you are. You need to exercise your right as a citizen to, and be a responsible citizen, to to put people, to put representatives in power that will advocate and that will speak up for the environment, for endangered species, for these things that we care about, because we have power as consumers and as individuals, and that can take you so far. But you need that leadership, that political leadership, in places that matter, to really, put us over the top, and address things like climate change, where we need to act as a global community, as a global society, to address, trade policies and whatnot. So those are the things that I would ask people to do.
No, yeah, that's great. Those are great suggestions. And then, real quick, which social media can they follow you on? Which ones are you guys on?
We are on Facebook, Twitter, and
Okay,
Instagram, and
perfect.
they can, all of them have the same handle, and that's Trunks and Leaves. That's trunks like tree trunks or elephant trunks, the letter N, and leaves, Trunks and Leaves. And our website is trunksandleaves.org.
Yeah, I'll list that on the show notes for everybody. But I like blinked and that was over. That was great. Dr. Shermin de Silva, the founder of Trunks and Leaves. We love elephants here, obviously, and our listeners do too. And thank you for your insight. I think, looking at all these different species across the planet, and then, specifically Asian elephants, you give us a lot of hope. People like you give us a lot of hope that we're out there fighting for these animals, using science, starting foundations like you did, doing what you do. So I just want to say from our listeners and from Angie, thank you so much. And thank you for spending an hour with us and talking about Trunks and Leaves and all the work you're doing.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for having me again, and for the great work that your show is doing, getting all these viewpoints and getting all these stories out. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Take care.